Now bear that in mind, because I certainly grew up with this kind of paradigm of the British vehicles being armed with something called a quote-unquote 2-pounder pop gun. That's not a pop gun. That is bigger than the standard German anti-tank gun of the day, which was a 37mm. It's bigger than the standard American tank gun, fitted to things like the M3 and the M5, which was a 37mm. So that is an impressive bit of kit. The only problem is, it only fires solid shot. It doesn't fire high explosive. So if you're engaging enemy tanks, this particular vehicle was great against Italian tanks. Italian tanks were lightly armoured. This could take on the M1340s and this kind of thing without any problem at all. It was okay against lighter German armour, but as German armour got heavier, that 2-pounder became obsolete, or at least obsolescent. And we were kind of stuck with it. You'll hear this story again when the Garrison Artillery come out here. We were kind of stuck with the 2-pounder because that's what we were producing. You don't, there's an old adage about changing horses in midstream. You don't start to rejig your factories in the middle of a war. We had factories which were producing 2-pounders. We continued with them as long as we could. They did come up with a little gizmo called a Little John adapter you could screw on the end of this gun. That squeezed the bore and it gave the outgoing shell greater velocity, but it still wasn't capable of penetrating heavy German armour. So the Daimler armoured car was relegated, if you will, to the role of a reconnaissance vehicle. It did that throughout the war. It served well into the 50s and 60s in that role. Perhaps most famous commander of one of these was the Hollywood film star David Niven, who served in them after D-Day. Same engine, similar engine to the Dingo, not quite the same. Same gearbox as the Dingo, slightly better rearward driving situation, whereas the driver on the Dingo has to cat himself round. Here our commander, if he gets into trouble, he could drop down into the tank, into the armoured car. He's got a rearward facing driving seat and rearward facing controls. And if you look very, very, very closely as he comes round, you'll see a tiny little hatch in the back that he can see through the drive from. So able to get himself out of danger, out of difficulty very quickly. Same monocoque construction, no chassis to get in the way. Similar kind of tyres, so a very effective bit of kit. Do take the opportunity to have a look at the one inside the museum where you can see that driving position. Right, so the Daimler armoured car. Oh, there she goes. Almost. Okay. Daimler, as I was saying, dates back to the early 1940s, so perhaps the fact that it's a little bit crotchety now is to be expected. They're working on that one, but while they're doing that, we've got the final vehicle in this display. And I know we've said this is a display of wheeled vehicles, but they have given me a tank out here. Tanks have got wheels, lots of them. This is the M24 Chaffee, and it's interesting because in many ways we've got two examples here of a very similar vehicle, of a relatively heavily armed reconnaissance vehicle. We'll come to that in a moment. Now, the Chaffee was introduced very, very late in World War II. It just about arrived in time for the Battle of the Bulge, but only two of them actually took part in that campaign. They were held back for the same reason we held our Comet back, because the crews weren't familiar with them, and therefore they didn't want to commit them to combat in an unfamiliar vehicle. The problem with light American tanks, and this is a relatively light tank, it weighs in a shade under 20 tons, so in sort of global terms that's really quite a light vehicle. The problem with American light tanks like the M3 Stuart, the M5 variant of the Stuart, was that they were undergunned. They had that 37mm gun on there. It was incapable of dealing with German armour. What they needed was a vehicle that would take a bigger gun, and if you want a bigger gun, you need a bigger turret, bigger hull. So basically, if you're going to upgun that light tank, you end up with something a bit like the Chaffee here. Now the gun itself is interesting. That's a 75mm. Okay, 40mm here on the Daimler, 75 on the Chaffee. It's fires the same ammunition as the M4 Sherman. The gun is pared down. It is lighter construction than the gun on the Sherman, so it won't have the same kind of barrel age or barrel lifespan on it that you would expect from a Sherman, but it is able to deliver a sizable punch. Wasn't designed for a tank. It was designed to be fitted to the B-25 Mitchell bomber as a kind of tank-busting aircraft. There was a bit of a fad for this towards the end of the war. They were fitting heavy guns to things like Hurricanes, Mosquitoes, and what have you. This was going to be fitted onto a Mitchell bomber. That project failed. They had a lot of these guns. They were able to put them onto the Chaffee. It's got twin Cadillac engines there at the back. It's very quick. It's got a good gun. The only beef that the crew had about it was that it was too lightly armoured. To keep that weight down, the armour was sacrificed. You can't have everything. You can't have firepower, mobility and protection. Something has to give. Protection was the one that went on the Chaffee to an extent, so that was a little bit of a grumble about that, but it was an excellent machine. This particular one, you'll notice, is in British colours. A few of these were supplied to the 7th Armoured Div. They had been using M3 Stuarts as their reconnaissance tank. They were given the Chaffies and they loved them, they liked them. They were the real advance on the rather aging Stuart. They went on to fight in Korea, not quite so successfully. The first American tanks to arrive in Korea when the North Koreans invaded were tanks from the occupation force in Japan using Chaffies. When the Chinese came over the frontier, they were using Russian-built T-34-85s, so the Chaffee was outgunned, I'm afraid. It wasn't until the British Centurions and heavier American tanks turned up that balance was redressed. They were also used in the fighting in Indochina, right? The old name for Vietnam, when the French were trying to defend their colony there at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, bits of Chaffee were literally parachuted onto the battlefield, reassembled in situ to fight the Viet Minh, as they were called in those days. Not terribly successfully, none of those survived, I fear. But there we are, there's the Chaffee tank, an excellent piece of kit. This one painted up in the colours of the 7th Armoured Div and proudly flying the Union Jack.